no bom sentido da próxima hora. O professor Mangione foi convidado no âmbito do Ministério da Informática Médica, sobretudo por iniciativa do Miguel, da Faculdade de Ciências e Biologia, que tem um projeto em comum relativo aos cefaloscópios digitais, e o professor Mangione tem-se envolvido em diferentes projetos por causa de que ele tem duas facetas, sobretudo. Por um lado, faz o ensino, está ligado ao ensino, de alguma maneira, da fisiologia, da semiologia, nas escolas Jefferson, nos Estados Unidos, e, por outro lado, também está ligado ao ensino da história da medicina. Tem um gosto muito especial pelo Leonardo da Vinci. Portanto, eu penso que vão gostar imenso. Ele originalmente vem de Itália, de Roma. Acho uma pessoa muito interessante, uma personalidade multifacetada, como Abraão.
And well, I have made a full presentation in Portuguese, but just to start and to warm up a little bit things. But what I would like to say now is to thank being here. I think it will be a terrific experience for all of us. All the people that are here, they are because they love Leonardo, and they are very curious about your talk.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me. Really appreciate. It's a packed talk, but I'll try to go slow. And I will start by saying that this talk was prepared a year ago, because in Philadelphia we had a symposium on art and science, and Leonardo is the symbol of how the boundaries between art and science are purely illusory, since he was a humanist who happened to be both an artist and a scientist. There was another reason why I put together this talk, and it's because for the past 20 years, I was reminded daily that I come from a genetic pool that produced this man, and so it was reassuring for me to think that I also come from a genetic pool that produced this man. And the two could not have been any more different. In fact, Leonardo himself spoke about what was really important to him. He writes in the Madrid Codex, and this is not working, so I'm going to control it from here. He writes, "I wish to work miracles. This may mean that I will eventually own less than other men with more quiet lives, or than those who want to get rich in a day. I may even have to live for a long time in great poverty, as often happens, and to all eternity will always happen to those who want to acquire knowledge. Yet, don't call riches those that may be lost. Virtue is our only true wealth and the true reward of its possessor. As for property and material wealth, these you should always hold in fear, since they often leave their possessor in shame, mocked at for having lost them all. Hence, study me, reader, if you delight in me." And this is again from the Madrid Codex, and we do delight in the man, and so we do study him. For the talk of today, this is what it left us. It's more than 250 anatomical drawings, and yet there is one particular one that has always touched me very deeply, and is this particular drawing, which became the subject of a paper in Nature. In fact, in Nature, Martin Kemp defined it as a miracle of intense presentation. And this is exactly what I mean with the boundaries between art and science being totally illusory. This is a work of art, it's a work of beauty, and it's also a perfect work of science. So he left us around 200 anatomical drawings. He dissected 30 cadavers. He told us so. These were men, women, children, and fetuses. Now, there is, if you're interested, an app for the iPad which was developed in England during one of the last exhibits on Leonardo, commissioned by the Queen, who owns all these drawings. My first encounter with Leonardo was in medical school. There was an exhibition in Florence, and I'm from Rome, so I took the train to go and see this exhibition in 1979 in Palazzo Vecchio in Florence. The Queen had sent down a total of 60 of the 268 folios that she owns, and I was totally blown away by their beauty. Now, it's a small part of the entire production. It's probably 2/3 of the original production. They are breathtakingly beautiful. And they are also pioneering in knowledge. So again, this amazing mix of beauty, art, and science. It's the very first serious step towards modern medicine. And there's no doubt that they blur the boundaries between the two fields. Leonardo took tremendous personal risk in doing this. He was very brave and very courageous. And they are probably his greatest accomplishment as a human being. He wanted to write a book in medicine, a book in anatomy, and had even picked up a title. He wanted to call it De Figura Umana, and we know that because he tells us so. If you take a look at this part of the drawing and you flip it so you can read the original Italian, he writes AD 1489, April 2nd, write a book titled De Figura Umana. Unfortunately, he never did so. Leonardo, unfortunately for us, finished very few of the projects he had started. If he had done this, if he had finished this book, medicine the way we know it would have been revolutionized. Unfortunately, when he died in 1519, all these drawings remained a jumble of disorganized material, and pretty soon they got scattered throughout Europe. So their significance was lost for close to 400 years. It was only in 1774, just 2 years before the American Revolution, that William Hunter, the founder of British Obstetrics and Gynecology, was approached by the librarian of Windsor Castle, who told him, Dr. Hunter, I found this chest, and it's full of anatomical drawings. Would you like to take a look at that? And that's how he looked at that amazing work of beauty of the fetus in the womb, which is very interesting because Hunter was working on placental vessels. They been there for 300 years. The first facsimile is only published in 1892, and so Leonardo basically hibernated for close to 400 years. All of this because when he died, he left his entire production to Francesco Melzi. Melzi had followed him to France. He was in his 20s when Leonardo died, and became the one who collected all his drawings and all his work. He was supposed to publish them, but he never did. He took them to Villa Melzi, which is not too far from Padua, and he was willing to show them to anyone who had an interest. This may be relevant for us because this past year, in December, was the anniversary of Vesalio's birth, was the 500th anniversary of Vesalio's birth. And there is a school of thought from Germany that believes that Vesalius was actually inspired by Leonardo's drawings, even though he never acknowledged it. Leonardo left Melzi a total of 50 to 55 notebooks. They were leather bound, and he encouraged his students to carry them chained to a belt so that they could be used whenever they had an idea. And according to Leonardo, the best ideas had to be visual. So this was a brain that thought in pictures. 13,000 pages, we only have half of them, which basically means that more than half of Leonardo's thoughts, ideas, and drawings were lost to mankind. And that is probably his fault. Leonardo said that to conceive an idea is noble, but to execute it is servile. So for him, what was important was the ideation, not the practical aspect of it. How did he produce them? There were no pencils in those years, so Leonardo used primarily three media. Quick and dirty was metal point. This was a silver tip stylus that was used on special paper coated with paint with a special dye, and the reaction between the silver of the tip and the coating with dye created the image. The problem is that this image faded rapidly. For example, what you see there is the depiction of the spinal column of a frog, but you miss totally, unless you use ultraviolet light, that there is a drawing there, and that drawing faded. So Leonardo knew that if you use metal point, you had to go back and redraw it with ink and pen. So most of the drawings I'll show you today are indeed in ink and pen. And that's how he produced these amazing cross cuts and cutouts of the skull. Now, you also notice that the pattern of hatching goes from the top left to the bottom right, because that's exactly how a left-handed man would have done it. So Leonardo clearly was left-handed. Also notice how he pioneers this technique of cutouts. That's the first time that was ever done, and that's how he describes the maxillary sinus, and that's how he describes also the frontal sinus, and he's the first person to correctly number the teeth. Till then, hadn't been done. Leonardo also used red chalk, but not a lot. There was not a lot of it in Europe, had to be quarried in special parts of the continent, and Leonardo used it for highlights. For example, in this figure you see it, and interestingly enough, in his entire anatomical production, it's only the features that he decided to highlight by using red chalk. He also used charcoal, but not a lot, and all of this between the period of 1479 and 1516. In fact, we're coming up to the 500th anniversary of when the church basically told Leonardo to stop dissecting bodies. While he was doing that, he also had to make a living, and he did that by doing commission portraits. This is the only one that is in America, is in Washington. Of course, he pioneered the technique of the black background, which will be revisited by Caravaggio and Rembrandt. He had to ideate machines of war, because that's what paid his salary, do these amazing bird views of Italian cities, and at the same time, dabble in architecture, in sculpture, create some of the most iconic works of the Renaissance, including, of course, the Last Supper and the Mona Lisa. But through it all, there were two special interests for which he really wasn't paid, but which he kept up throughout his life. And they were human flight and flight in general, and anatomy. It's been said that Leonardo, who was a brain for hire, was the subject of Baldassare Castiglione, the Book of the Courtier. He was indeed the ultimate courtier. So when at the age of 27, 28, he had been released from jail under accusations of sodomy in Florence and decided it was time to leave Florence, he sent a letter to the Duke of Milan, Ludovico il Moor, and we have a copy of that letter, and the bulk of it is aimed at describing his skills in producing machines of war. It's only at the very end that he says, I'm also an artist. And all of this because Leonardo knew that to make a living in the Italy of those years, you had to deal with war, even though he considered war the most bestial madness. The Italy of his years is an Italy that is divided, and he will divide his life through three main cities. Clearly the Florence of his birth, he was born nearby, the Milano of where he came of age, and ultimately the Rome, where he will spend the last years in Italy before going to France. Leonardo gets to Tokyo and he learns how to become an artist. Leonardo has very little, if any, formal education. It's interesting that three of the most creative people that ever lived, Leonardo da Vinci, Benjamin Franklin, and Thomas Edison, have very little formal education, which makes you wonder whether formal education kills creativity. So Leonardo leaves Milan, Florence for Milan, and he goes to work for the city of Pavia that he dissects. He was dissecting in Florence, but in Pavia he starts dissecting with a scientific interest, not anymore an artistic interest. The French take Milan, and so he goes back to Florence. In Florence, he continues to dissect in the Ospedale of Santa Maria Nuova that still exists. Then he goes back to Milan, and these are 4 very productive years, because in nearby Pavia, there is an anatomist named Marcantonio della Torre, and the 2 men become friends. They really are thinking about writing an anatomy textbook. But then there is a plague epidemic. Marcantonio della Torre dies in 1512, and Leonardo leaves Milan for Rome. Rome is where the action is. There's money, and there are movers and shakers. There is a young Michelangelo. There is a young Raphael. Leonardo is older. He's in his 60s. He's considered passé. He doesn't get commissions. He still dissects in this hospital, which still stands, and it's the Ospedale di Santo Spirito. I got 15 stitches to my armpit in that hospital when I was a kid. But then he gets into trouble. He's denounced by a German collaborator for necromancy and mistreatment of cadavers, and he leaves. Just 1 year before Luther, he goes to France, and within 3 years, he will be dead. And all of this because, of course, he was dissecting fetuses, which didn't go down too well with the church. So he goes to France, and he's a guest of the king. The king puts him up in this beautiful castle on the Loire Valley. And it's in this room, on May the 2nd, 1519, that Leonardo leaves this earth. The room, and I went to see it a few years ago, iconic and famous, and yet it's badly damaged. There are molds. They never show it. The very last time that was shown was in 2011, and it got to the museum at 11 a.m. of 11/11/11, which was not intentional, and yet it's very symbolic. The number 11 is the number of genius, because it's a double digit of the same number. And there is no doubt that Leonardo is the ultimate epitome of human genius, the greatest, most eclectic human being that probably ever lived. Sigmund Freud wrote only one biography, and it was on Leonardo da Vinci. And he called him one that awoke too early in the darkness while everybody else was still asleep. Let's get back to this portrait. Kenneth Clark writes, "This great furrowed mountain of a face, with its noble brow, cavernous eyes, and undulating foothills of a beard, is like the face of all great men of the 19th century, as the camera preserved them for us: Darwin, Tolstoy, Walt Whitman." So a few lines, we see a broad forehead, bushy eyebrows, sad, pensive, and baggy eyes, and the receding upper lip of somebody who probably lost his teeth, and in those years, people lost their teeth rather young. There's a long flowing beard, and that is unusual for the Italy of his times, because this contemporary tells us that Italy in those years didn't have beards. There were only two people that wore beards: mourners and eccentrics. And Leonardo was probably both. He was mourning the death of his father, and he was clearly an eccentric who dressed and behaved in ways that were completely different from the mainstream. Now, how do we know that this is indeed Leonardo? Well, first of all, they tell us so. Down at the bottom, quite this color, is an inscription. And if you magnify it, you see Leonardo, made by himself and quite old. Remember that the word self-portrait doesn't become part of the lexicon till the 1800s. And now, of course, we have the word selfie. Till then, people said made by himself. Now, Leonardo was also described as looking like that by contemporaries. Leonardo's face had long hair, bushy eyebrows, long flowing beard, to the point that he resembled all that is noble in study and knowledge. Now, he also looked a lot older, apparently, 10 years older at least. And that may explain why in this picture taken when he was only in his early 60s, he looks in his 80s. He's a sad, pensive look, the sad of somebody who loves mankind but has a problem with human beings. And Leonardo was that kind of man, the ultimate misanthropic humanist. He referred to us as the stultified multitude. He told us that independent-mindedness is the only thing that saves us. He wrote, "If you are alone, you're all yours. If you are with someone, you're only half yours." When I see a man holding a book, I often expect him to sniff it like a monkey or wonder if it's edible. Ultimately, most human beings are only good for filling toilets. That's the man. Now, that particular description, of course, matches perfectly the one made by Raphael in the School of Athens. And we do know that Plato is modeled after Leonardo. In fact, Plato wears a pink toga. Leonardo was famous for wearing pink. Now, this is from 1509, 1511, which is when Leonardo is 59. So he had a beard. Now, that is also Leonardo, made by Francesco Melzi, his young assistant. Leonardo is 55, which is still with a beard. That particular drawing is also owned by the Queen of England. And then there is this page from the Codex on the Flight of Birds. This depicts, of course, the flight of birds. The Codex is kept in Turin. And believe it or not, it was only a couple of years ago that people realized that embedded in this page, there is a face. Can you see it? Can you see that there is a face there? It took this reporter that was doing a show for Italian television to point out to the curator that there was a face, had never been seen. So they use computer technology to bring it out. And if you do that, and you match it to the self-portrait of Leonardo, is a perfect match. Now, Leonardo at that age didn't have a beard, and that is when his father is about to die. So he grew a beard as a mourning sign for the death of his father, and then he kept it. Now, he portrayed himself a lot because this contemporary tells us about it. He says, there is a painter nowadays who has so fixed in his conception the image of himself that whenever he wishes to paint someone else, he actually paints himself. So what did Leonardo look like as a young man? The very first thing we have of him is this Adoration of the Magi, made as a commission that was procured to him by his father. Leonardo in 1481 is 29. He never finishes this thing. He pockets the money, but he never finishes the work. And there's very good evidence that this lonely figure, not even paying attention, is actually a self-portrait of Leonardo at 29. That's the way he looked. And it matches quite well this young David made by Verrocchio, because Vasari tells us that David was based on young Leonardo working for Verrocchio at the age of 15. The two actually had a relationship. Now, this is a fresco that was made by Bramante. Bramante is the guy who designs the facade of St. Peter. And we know that the figure on the right is a self-portrait of Bramante, but the figure on the left is based on his friend, Leonardo da Vinci. In 1497, Leonardo is 45. So Leonardo at 15, and then there is the musician. This is the only portrait of a man ever made by Leonardo. Everything else are portraits of women. And notice that he's wearing pink. And he's also holding a sheet of music. This portrait is in Milan, was made in 1485. Leonardo was 33. He had just arrived to Milan. And there is good evidence that this is a self-portrait. He's holding a sheet of music. Leonardo had a beautiful voice and he played the lyre. It's actually one of the things he writes in his job description to the Duke. And then there is Vitruvian Man. And Vitruvian Man, according to this book, in 1490, at the age of 38, is a self-portrait. So let's review Leonardo. This is him at 33, him at 38, and him at 65. The same broad forehead, the same horizontal eyebrows, the same long aquiline nose, same curved lips, and the same small notched and well-developed chin. Very much a match with the Leonardo at 15 made by Verrocchio. He was a handsome man. He also has these very prominent cheekbones that have led people to believe that he might have been, we know he was an illegitimate son. His father had it with a peasant girl, but there are some theories that actually that peasant girl might have been a Croatian slave that had been sold on the market by the Venetian. A contemporary writes, he was very attractive, well-proportioned, graceful, and good-looking. He had beautiful curling hair, carefully styled, which came down to the middle of his chest. He wore a short, rose-pink tunic, knee-length, at a time when most people wore long gowns. He was always doing things differently. In appearance, he was so strikingly handsome that his magnificent presence brought comfort to the most troubled soul, writes Vasari. He was also generous, so that he fed all his friends, rich or poor. In fact, his disposition was so lovable that he commanded everyone's affection. He was a sparkling and witty conversationalist, so charming, so persuasive that he could bend other people to his will. Yet, he was also physically strong, so that he, with his right hand, which was the non-dominant hand, he could bend a horseshoe. Many men and women are born with various remarkable qualities and talents, writes Vasari, but only occasionally in a way that transcends nature. A single person is marvelously endowed by heaven with beauty, grace, and talent in such abundance that he leaves other men far behind. Everyone acknowledged this was true of Leonardo da Vinci, an artist of outstanding physical beauty who displayed infinite grace in everything he did and who cultivated his genius so brilliantly that all problems he studied were solved with ease. He was a man of great strength, dexterity, regal spirit, and amazing breadth of mind. So let's talk about the mind of Leonardo. It's a mind that thinks in pictures. So 30% of us think in pictures, the rest think in words. There's very little doubt that thinking in picture, thinking visually, is the undercurrent of creativity. This is the very first drawing we have of Leonardo, and it depicts the hills of his native Vinci. Now, all of his ideas are expressed usually in pictures, rarely in text. And this is one of the articles that suggests how visual spatial thinking should be fostered because it is the fundamental undercurrent of creativity. Kenneth Clark writes, "It's often said that Leonardo drew so well because he knew about things. It's truer to say that he knew about things because he drew so well." At Jefferson, this year we have created a drawing class, and we have actually taken students to learn how to draw, the idea being that that develops a different capacity to see, which may be very good for a physician. Now, Leonardo knew about the importance of visual thinking because he writes in this folio how important it is to him. This is the depiction of a Knox heart, and next to it, you have to flip the Italian to read it. He writes, "How can you describe this heart in words without filling a whole book? The longer you write, the more you will confuse the listener. And you would only end up knowing a few things, never the whole. Hence, draw first and describe later." And then on top, he goes directly for the jugulars. And here is what he writes. "Writer, what kind of words will you fetch to awkwardly describe what drawing can instead so beautifully represent? Don't bother with words unless you're speaking to the blind. Don't mess with things that belong to the eyes. Don't try to smuggle them as something belonging instead to the ears. You will always be overruled by the painter." In medicine, we think in words, or at least many of us think in words. Oliver Wendell Holmes was professor of anatomy at Harvard, and he writes this review of a new anatomy textbook, and he doesn't like it because it has too many pictures. Here's what he writes. "Let a student have illustrations, and just so surely he will use them at the expense of the text. Look, for instance, at two of the most successful anatomic books ever published, both of which have gone through several editions, and neither of them has a single illustration." So he's bad-mouthing the new edition of Gray's Anatomy, which according to him had too many pictures. Of course, we have a long tradition of physicians who think in pictures. Frank Neder was a good example, but Leonardo is undoubtedly the first. Here are the innovations that his visual spatial thinking blesses us with. He uses exploded views and he pioneers them to show the relationships of the parts to the whole. He draws each part free of surrounding tissue, but then he connects them with guidelines so that we can get a sense of how they belong to the whole. And the guidelines are a constant throughout his work. He pioneers the idea of multiple views, as if we were looking around the object in a multi-angle cinematographic view. In fact, he takes away the muscles and he boils them down to force lines, to wings, to wires, to strings that give you a sense of the location of the muscle, but allow you to see the bone. And then he pioneers the three standard views, the sagittal, the coronal, and the cross-sectional. He is the first to describe the origin, the insertion, and the innervation of muscles, the agonist-antagonist function, the system of pronation and supination, the proper femur's position that really wasn't known. And he writes, "These drawings I have made of the human body appear to you very much as if you had the cadaver in front of your eyes. And the reason this is so is because in order to fully know the anatomy, you have to turn the cadaver around, or alternatively, turn your eye, glancing from multiple angles." And that's how he comes up with this idea of taking the parts out, doing the cutouts. This particular cutout, this cross-section, allows him to identify the maxillary sinus. He's the first to get there, and yet we still refer to it as the Hymor antrum, even though Leonardo got there 150 years before. Should they be renamed Leonardo's antrum? Here you see the maxillary and the frontal sinus, and in this beautiful sagittal section, you actually see his attempts to identify this sensus communis, the seat of the soul. There was a big push in those years to either locate it in the brain, and Leonardo believed that was in the sella turcica, or to locate it in the heart. Leonardo is a believer that the seat of the soul, the sensus communis, the common sense, is in the sella turcica. His interest in the skull brings him to identify the meningeal arteries and the multiple layers of the brain, which he compares to the multiple layers of an onion. And he's quite correct in identifying the various layers. He also pioneers the technique of injecting the ventricles with molten wax. So he gives us not only a depiction of the ventricles, but also a quantification in volume. In the nervous system, he's pioneering the origin of peripheral nerves. He spends 20 years trying to isolate the brachial plexus, and eventually is successful. He rediscovers something that was known to the Greeks, but had been forgotten, that some nerves are sensory, some are motor, and some are both. He also identifies that some reactions are independent from the human will. They are reflexes. And he writes, "Nerves sometimes work without the command of the soul." He realizes that the center of this arc is in the spinal cord, and he calls it the captain. And he's the first to identify agonist-antagonist action, something that will have to be rediscovered by Sherrington. He writes, "Even this information can be inadequate as a result of the confusion caused by overlapping membranes, arteries, nerves, ligaments, muscles, bones, blood, which stains everything in red. Hence, do more than one dissection. In fact, 3 are necessary to provide full information on arteries and veins, 3 on membranes, 3 for ligaments, 3 for muscles and tendons, 3 for bones and cartilages, 3 for the anatomy of bones that have to be sewed so that you can see which bones are hollow. And lastly, 3 dissections are necessary for understanding the female anatomy, which harbors the great secret of life and over fetus." So towards the end of his scientific research, he gets into the fetus. He's trying to identify when the soul implants in the fetus, and he's fascinated by intercourse. So this is one drawing that he dedicates to intercourse, which is indeed the subject of a lifelong fascination. People have actually speculated how Leonardo might have sublimated his own sexuality in scientific pursuits. According to Sigmund Freud, he was probably asexual, more than a gay man. But it's interesting that here, and this is made at the heyday of the syphilis epidemic, is hinting of how intercourse may be responsible for this disease that is going around, but also how intercourse is responsible for the implantation of the soul. He writes, "I reveal through this drawing to men the origin of their first and perhaps second cause of existence." So he's referring to the physical origin and the spiritual origin. And here he writes, "By means of these figures, the cause of many risks of ulcers and diseases is demonstrated." So again, he had intuited this new disease that had been brought from the New World to Europe that was going through Italy in 1494 was sexually transmitted. There's something else here that is interesting. Leonardo is the ultimate iconoclast. He doesn't accept dogma, he destroys dogma. He tells us all the time that it's much more important to observe than to rely on books. And yet, in this cross-section of the penis, you see that there are two channels. So there is a urethra, and then there is this additional channel that doesn't exist. But Leonardo takes it from Galen. Galen mentioned that sperm is channeled independently from the cord, and Leonardo buys it. So even though he's the ultimate iconoclast, he still buys what Galen is saying, which is a little bit what Vesalius was doing at the very beginning. Now, this obsession with intercourse is also interesting in the sense that Leonardo portrays this very perplexing androgynous figure. If you think of the Mona Lisa, is androgynous. And this is something that the Queen of England had in her own collection and immediately sold to the Germans. It resurfaced in Berlin a few years ago. And it's an ultimate androgynous figure. So it has a penis and a breast. It's a sketch, a preparatory sketch for the St. John. So when Leonardo dies in France, at the bedside, he has two canvases. One is the John the Baptist, which is now at the Louvre, and here you see it. The other one is the Mona Lisa. And I really think that what he was trying to basically tell himself and us is that ultimately the soul is, and of right ought to be, androgynous. There's actually a beautiful book written by Carlo Pedretti, who's probably the major scholar in Leonardo, on this particular figure, and according to him, the model was Salai, the young kid that he had adopted. So Leonardo is a little bit of an odd ball. He's an outsider. Let's review how. He's a vegetarian in a country of gluttons. He's a left-handed man in a nation where the church is telling you that the left is the hand of the devil. He's a bastard in a culture where only legitimate sons can hope for success. He's a self-educated ignoramus who's shunned by academia because he knows no Latin and no Greek. And he's a gay man in a macho culture. So he's the ultimate outsider, which might actually be good for you. Because, as Colin Wilson wrote in the 50s, if you are marginalized by the group, you can react in two ways. You can get depressed, or you can say, screw them. I'm much better than them, and I will prove it. And that's what Leonardo did. This was recently, by the way, published by Hopkins, that many people that contribute in all fields of human endeavor are indeed outsiders. Leonardo writes about that. He's complaining about the intelligentsia, blaming him for not being a cultivated and educated man. He writes, I am fully conscious that not being a literary man, certain presumptuous folks might reasonably blame me for not being a man of letters. Fools! Don't they know that I might retort by saying that they who deck themselves in the labor of others don't know that these studies are to be dealt with experience rather than empty words? Experience has always been the mistress of those who wrote well, and I will always use her as my mistress in all cases. So that's how he gets, in many ways, to the scientific method, is observation. And if you think that it's better to do your own dissection rather than studying on pictures, keep in mind that this would be true only if you could see at once all the things that are shown so clearly in my drawings. Yet, despite all your effort and intelligence, this would be impossible because everything is a jumble of vessels. So always do many dissections. As I was telling you, Leonardo did some of his best dissections in this hospital, not too far from the train station of Florence. It still stands. And here it is. I was there this past March. It's the oldest active hospital on the planet. It was actually built by the father of Dante's Beatrice in 1288 and has been active ever since. Leonardo keeps his money there because the monks also serve as bankers. As a result, they let him dissect people that die there without families. So here's what he tells us. An old man, a few hours from his death, told me that he had lived more than 100 years and that he felt nothing wrong with his body other than weakness. And thus, while sitting upon a bed in the Ospedale of Santa Maria Nuova in Florence, without any movement or any other sign of mishap, he passed out of his life. It's a beautiful scene. Leonardo is in his 50s, this old man is confiding to him, and he dies in his arms. What is Leonardo's reaction? And I immediately made an autopsy of him, so that I could learn the cause of such a sweet death. So he comes across a little cold. But look at the inside. I found this to be the result of arterial and hepatic insufficiency to both the heart and the lower extremities, which I found withered, wrinkled, and dry. This autopsy I describe really well, owing to the absence of fatty humors. And in fact, this is my office at Jefferson in Philadelphia. This particular quote stands in the back in badly spelled Italian. This is how Leonardo comes to the inside of arteriosclerosis. Now, that particular basement of Santa Maria Nuova where he dissected is actually available, but not to the public. And this past March, thanks to a connection, I was able to see it. And here is where Leonardo dissected. So it's in the basement of the hospital. It's not entirely clear where those vats are for, maybe to wash the cadaver, but I want you to imagine the scene. So this is the winter of 1508, 1509. Winters in Florence are cold. Cadavers can last 3-4 days with that. So he's doing the dissections, but he also is doing the sketching, probably with silver point, and then he has to go back home and finish them up with ink and pen. There are people holding torches. They're probably helping him out with the body. He has no idea of the germ theory because nobody has a germ theory. So he's cutting things. He's exposing himself to tremendous risk. And the following day, he has to make a living by doing the regular things. That's what Leonardo was doing for 30 years of his life. So he dissects the old man, and then within a few days he dissects a little boy, a boy of 2 years, and he found everything totally different compared to the old man, and then he puts them together. And he comes to the intuition that vessels in a young individual are very different from vessels in an old man. In fact, if you flip it, you can read giovane, young, and vecchio, old. And you see how the vessels of the vecchio are very tortuous. And he writes, the nature of veins in youth and age, as the veins grow old, they destroy the straightness of their ramification. They develop thicker coats. And he intuits that those thicker coats come from an overabundance of nourishment from the blood, and that this clogs the vessels and eventually causes the death of the old man. And he calls it malattia arteriosclerotica. Now, how did he manage to get these insights? So how did Leonardo's brain work? Leonardo was so voraciously curious of any field that he was able to cross-pollinate from the fact that he knew so much of so many things. He writes, the acquisition of any knowledge is always useful to the intellect because it banishes the useless things and retains only the good one. Nothing can be loved or hated till it's first fully known. So he's voraciously curious. He has no difference between a left and a right brain. He probably had a humongous corpus callosum. We do know that what made Einstein's brain so unique was a larger, richer, and thicker corpus callosum. Incidentally, what is that allows you to develop a large, rich, and thick corpus callosum? Playing musical instruments does that to you. Leonardo apparently had a knack, a gift for music. So the boundaries between the two cultures of Sipi Snow totally collapsed. This is the epitome of how they are illusory. Leonardo draws interest from anatomy, from hydraulics, he built canals, from nutrition to come to the intuition of atherosclerosis. And he writes that true knowledge has always to be rooted in observation and experience. So even though Bacon and Galileo really give us science, Leonardo comes to it a little earlier. Those who love art without science, he writes, are like mariners who go out to sea without neither rudder nor compass, so that they don't really know where they're going. Here is how his method works. First, it's observation. And for that, helps tremendously to have visual spatial skills, which clearly, as an artist, he had to the utmost. Then, through inductive reasoning, he comes to a theory, which is called scienza. And then he tests it continuously through what he calls arte, and he revises it. And eventually, he comes to a conclusion, which is practice. Fantasia is the conclusion, is the creative imagination. And of course, everything has to come from experience. When the grandest of all books, the universe, stands open before our eyes, he writes, and when one can go to the fountain, there is no need to go to the water jar. There is no need to go to the books. You got to start with observation. So when conventional medical knowledge was stuck at this level, and this is connecting diseases to astrological signs, Leonardo was giving us Vitruvian Man, which is an expression of his first interest in anatomy as a reflection of art. And Vitruvian Man is human proportions. He writes, from the breast to the top of the head is a quarter of the height of a man. He also writes that the pubis is half of the way up to the body. This is something, for example, there are medical students are not familiar with. Where is the center of the body? The center of the body is the pubis. This is actually pretty relevant because if you look at this kid, you realize how he's skewed. His own legs. Now, 1 out of 10,000 of us have been roaming the planet like that, but it took 1896 years after Jesus Christ for this Frenchman named Marfan to realize that this is a new condition. Now, interestingly enough, Marfan used to go a lot to Venice, and it's in the Academy of Venice the Vitruvian Man is kept, so I wonder whether he saw it. That's why I tell medical students that there are lots of diseases out there waiting for your name, if only they can see them. So Vitruvian Man is the first part of Leonardo's scientific output. And of course, it's probably the most iconic image, has been given in many permutations. As you know, the Italians put it on the €1, although recently has been suggested that Vitruvian Man should get the hell out of the euro. And this because of this, of course. Made it in space, and from Anatomia Artistica, he moves to Anatomia Scientifica. So, as Sigmund Freud writes, he's fascinated by the wonderful human machine and the nature of man. He writes, the artist that once taken into service the investigator in order to assist him, now the servant had grown stronger and thus suppressed his master. So he focuses on eye and vision, the nervous system, muscles and bones, the abdominal organs, the heart and the vessels, the reproductive system, and finally the fetus. The drawings are the main source of information. Text is very limited. Text, of course, is written right to left. Why right to left? Multiple theories. He was left-handed, and if you write right to left, you're less likely to smear. He was probably dyslexic. Many artists are. And in fact, there is actually some suggestion that his eyes might have been misaligned a little bit, which often you see in dyslexics. And dyslexics are very visual. So then dyslexics often write right to left. Last theory He was paranoid and he was afraid of his secrets being stolen. Now, here you see comparative anatomy, which he did. Here you see this technique of using strings to simulate muscles. He's the first, of course, to give us the exact curvature of the spine. Notice the guidelines and the exploded views. He pioneers cross-sections. Once again, strings and copper wires to show the location of muscles. Here you see the multiple layers of the brain again and the casting of the ventricles. He does the same for the human heart. Here you see the chasm. He's the first to understand that the eye doesn't project light, receives light. And is actually responsible for giving us description of every single cranial nerve except for the fourth, the trochlea. Depicts the foramen of Monro. Is fascinated by vision, intuits the dark room. He gets into movement, which of course he uses for his artistic output. Here you see the old man again. By the way, there is an exhibit that is going around and it's called Body Words, and it's produced by this German pathologist named Van Hagen. Has anybody ever seen them? They are plastinated bodies. And actually, some of them apparently are political prisoners executed in China, which he buys. It's interesting how, if you look at Leonardo's, the rendition of the cadaver is profoundly dignified. I'm not really sure that the Van Hagen rendition is dignified at all. And that's what I'm talking about. This is a paper written on plastination, and the keywords say it all. Fascination and disgust. Van Hagen is definitely not what Leonardo had in mind. None brought forward that wealth of anatomical detail with more reverence for life than Leonardo. Whether that life was human or animal. Remember, Leonardo became a vegan because he did not want to suppress any form of life. He was famous to go through the markets of Florence, buying cages of pigeons so he could free them. Again, muscles, pronation and supination, the bones of the hand, the fascia, these are beautiful. More guidelines, the muscles of facial expression. He gets into the abdomen. He is the first to describe the appendix. Finally, the heart, and I'm coming towards the end. Leonardo intuits, as you can see on the right, there are the eddies of ejection into the aorta that close the valves more than pressure. He actually describes the sinuses of Valsalva, much earlier than Valsalva. He builds himself a glass model of the aorta, and he uses millet seeds as dye to reach this conclusion. All of this because he draws on his knowledge of hydraulics. He describes the openings and the sinuses 200 years before Valsalva. I told you about how he understands that the closing of the valves is more caused by the eddies than by the pressure. He identifies the capillaries, or at least he names them and intuits them, although Malpighi will be the first to, of course, show them to us. And he understands that the heart is a pump. Now, here are the many first in cardiology. Multiple angles. Is the first to state the heart is a muscle. The first to describe it as four-chambered. The first to draw and understand the auricles correctly. The first to describe a patent foramen ovale. The first to draw and understand the valves correctly. And the first to work out the coronary circulation. Finally, the moderator band is still named after Leonardo. Then he gets into this, all hell breaks loose, and he goes to France. So when Leonardo stops dissecting, this was the standard of knowledge in medical textbooks. And this is what Leonardo left us, if he had published it. Goes to France with a nice retirement package. He gets a salary, and the king just does that for the pleasure of enjoying Leonardo's conversation. Unfortunately, it's also the end of his career. He comments, "The Medici made me, the Medici destroyed me. Of course, this is a pun. Leonardo didn't particularly like physicians, the Medici, but this, of course, is referring to Lorenzo the Magnificent, who made him, and the Pope, the Medici Pope, who forced him into exile. Kenneth Clark writes, of all the great Renaissance artists, Da Vinci alone was destined to fall from papal grace. In a larger sense, he was more dangerous than Borgia. Cesare just killed man. Da Vinci, like Copernicus, threatened the certitude that knowledge had been forever fixed by God. The rigid mindset that left no role for curiosity or innovation. Leonardo's cosmology, in effect, was a blunt instrument assaulting the fatuity, which had, among other things, permitted a mafia of profane popes to desecrate Christianity. Leonardo tries to console himself with philosophy. He writes, patience, equanimity, protects against misfortune as warm clothes protects against the cold. The warmer you dress, the more powerless the storm. In the same way, by increasing your equanimity in the face of great wrongs, you render them powerless against your peace of mind. When he goes to France, he comes up with a list of things to extend life. If you want to be healthy, observe this regimen. Don't eat when you have no appetite, dine lightly. Chew well, whatever you take into you should always be well cooked. He who takes medicine is ill-advised. Beware anger, avoid stuffy air. Stay standing a while when you get up from a meal. Make sure you don't sleep at midday. Let your wine be mixed with water, taken a little and often. Don't drink between meals. Neither delay nor prolong your visit to the bathroom. If you take exercise, let it not be too strenuous. Don't lie with your belly upward and your head downward. Be well covered at night. Rest your head. Keep your mind cheerful. Avoid wantonness. Keep to this diet. And when you finally learn how to live, you will learn how to die. But more importantly, the best way to preserve your health is by keeping as far away from physicians as you possibly can, since their medicines are always the product of quacks. Unfortunately, we all owe them money, the destroyers of life. Hence, they must be rich. So, he leaves us this decalogue on how to do what he did. Even if you love the research, you may be hindered by a weak stomach. And if you're not hindered by that, you may be hindered by fear of being at night in the company of these bodies, torn to pieces, skinned, frightening. And even if that doesn't bother you, you may lack the drawing skills, or you may lack the perspective. And if that isn't so, you may fail the arrangement or not be thorough. Whether or not I have succumbed to these things, you may judge for yourself. But if I have failed, it's not because of negligence or laziness, but just because of time. Farewell. So he gets ready for his death. Like a day well spent brings a happy sleep, so a life well spent brings a peaceful death. And he dies. Melzi writes his brothers, I understand that you've been informed of the death of Master Leonardo, your brother, who was like an excellent father to me. It's impossible to express the grief I feel at his death, and as long as my limbs sustain me, I will feel eternal sadness, which is justified by the consuming and sweet love he bore daily towards me. Everyone is grieved by the loss of such a man, whose like nature no longer has it in her power to produce. And now may Almighty God grant him eternal rest. 50 years later, Vasari writes, Heaven sometimes sends us beings who represent no humanity alone, but divinity. Through the birth of Leonardo, Florence received a great gift, and through his death, it sustained an incalculable loss. The last words are for Kenneth Clark. Like his contemporaries, we no longer think of Leonardo as a scientist, as a seeker for measurable truth, but we think of him as a magician, a man who, from his close familiarity with the processes of nature, has learned the disturbing secret of creation. In fact, it is actually rumored that when Shakespeare wrote his very last play, the character of Prospero in The Tempest was actually based on Leonardo. And that's how his fame had crossed the borders. So thank you so much for inviting me and for listening to this. I really appreciate. And if you have any question, I'm going to open it up. Thank you again. Questions? Yes.
And there is a connection to Portugal.
Okay.
Also, Portugal was bought by the King Albert somewhere. Do you know where it lies? Where it lies? Like in Portugal.
Yes, there's a king.
We have a plaza called by his name, and we have to have where
It's actually interesting that you bring him up because there's another connection with the king, and is that, and I have that because I have a strong interest in that. The Sindon, the shroud, was owned by the Savoy family, and when he died, he left it to the church. And that is an amazing piece of anatomical and physiologic detail. And actually, this year is shown again. Now, leaving it to the church was probably a mistake because now we have no access to it. Before it was a little easier. But yes, another connection. You're right.
no other question.
Yes.
Do you really think that Zalus has copied some of his drawings or
Okay, so yes, there is a theory, and I think it's a German theory, that actually saw that. What is very clear is that Vesali's personality was not particularly nice. This is a man who was confrontational, abrasive. So I would be surprised that if he saw them, he definitely write about it. There's no doubt that Nelson's villa, where he kept his things, and he was showing them, was a few miles from Padua. There is another theory that suggests that if you look at the muscle man and the background, and you can put them all together, it's like a panorama. That comes from Leonardo's book on painting, which actually is the only one that Nelson managed to publish. So I like to think that there's always an Italian who gets there first and then gets through. So I think yeah. Vesalius is a giant, but he's not a man that you would have liked to have dinner with. He was not very nice. Leonardo is definitely somebody I would have loved to have dinner. Although probably would not have loved to have dinner with me. But that's a different story. Yes.
Thank you for I'm not a scientist, I'm a designer.
Designer?
Yes, I teach at Faculty of Fine Arts in Oxford University. And I have a question. Why is, I want to have your opinion, of course. Why is Andreas Vesalius works so important in anatomy study? Because it was the first, because it was invited.
I lost the last part of your question. Say. Why Vesalius is so important? Yes, yes. So Vesalius is important because he's the first. No, it's not in many ways. So first of all, it's a beautiful mix of artistic beauty and science. So in that sense is Leonardo. Now, that is not Vesalius' credit. Vesalius was lucky enough to have near Padua the school of Titian. And so Van Kalkar, who probably was the one who did his amazing drawings, was a full-fledged artist. But for the first time, there is this mix of beauty and science, which till then hadn't really been part of anatomy. The real reason why Vesalius is so important, because he debunks Galen. So for 1300 years, medicine was frozen by the fact that Galen has stated certain things which were wrong, which were based on dissection of animals, but his dogma made it so valuable that even Leonardo portrays two channels in the penis, a urethra and something else that didn't exist because Galen had said so. So Vesalius is the first to say the magic word in medicine. And the magic word in medicine, and I don't know if it comes across clear, it's bullshit. You know what bullshit basically means? I don't believe it, and I'm going to test it. And I think Vesalius, in many ways, is a child of the Reformation. So, you know, the birth of science comes when, with the discovery of a new word, dogma suddenly collapses. That's in Bertolt Brecht, Galileo. Galileo says it's the mariners that did it. In many ways, was your mariners that did it. They showed that conventional wisdom was wrong. And for the first time, we challenge dogma. So what's the most important thing of Vesalius? He challenges dogma. He's a pioneer. The pioneers are the ones with the arrows in the back. So he pays a major price. But that's the, and I think part of his personality, which is so abrasive, is the reason why he goes against dogma. If he had been more charming, probably he would have believed dogma. So for us, what's the lesson? The lesson is trust no one, doubt everything, and that's the core of science. Yes?
But it is also true that the drawing, as I said, not we were completely less. So the Vesalius was actually the first, as I can see.
Oh, absolutely. Oh, yeah. Totally, yeah.
So it was just for anatomy, it was first.
Yeah. Unfortunately, Leonardo is irrelevant. He's so insightful and so ahead of his time, but nothing gets published. So absolutely, Vesalius is the first to give us true anatomy. He makes a lot of errors, but he's the first to give us that. But more than that, I think he's the first to challenge dogma. That's really what makes it, I think, so important for us. Yes. Say again? Yes, Vesalius is the first anatomist, or at least official anatomist. Unfortunately, Leonardo, for us, is irrelevant. All his insights never were published until hundreds of years later. So he really, there was a beautiful book, I remember years ago, on the 100 greatest geniuses. Leonardo isn't there because he didn't impact on our knowledge. It's really sad. It's almost, again, like God said, I'm going to make you a genius, but I'm going to make you irrelevant. Yeah. I think Leonardo, in many ways, is a tragic figure. The other thing which is interesting about him is he tells us very little about himself. Vesalius tells us a lot about himself, but Leonardo does not. For example, again, he was an illegitimate son. So his mother was this peasant girl, and the father took the baby, the child, away when he was just little. The only thing we know is that his mother was named Caterina. When Leonardo is in Milan as a 40-year-old man, he writes, "Today, Caterina came to live with us." And that's it. And then when she dies a couple of years later, so she must have been an old woman, he spends a fortune on her funeral. That was probably his mother. That's the only thing he writes. And when his father dies, he simply writes, "Today my father died. He left a certain number of children." So Leonardo comes across as cold, comes across as elusive, and we like elusive people, we run after them, and of course comes across as the greatest genius. So all of this make him profoundly attractive. That's why it's hard to find people in medicine who are not fascinated by Leonardo. but he's a tragic figure. He was not a happy man. He was a little bit of a loner. He picked his friends very carefully, and they were loyal to him. He's a tragic figure. Yep. Yes.
You mentioned there's a drawing class at Jefferson now.
There's a what? A drawing class. Yes, yes. Yeah, okay, so you probably are familiar with studies that were actually published about taking students to art museums and showing them artworks and proving that by doing that, they pick up 40% more physical findings. So it's the idea that you see with a better eye if you see as an artist. Now, we expanded it into teaching them how to draw. Ruskin, you know, the British critic, art critic, and was heavily into teaching people how to draw, any kind of people. And he wrote, I want carpenters to draw, not because I want them to become artists. I want them to become better carpenters. So we tried to tell the students, this is to develop your skills. Now, what did we find? I actually measure visual spatial thinking and detection of findings. I found that they see better, they see more. In terms of burnout, you know, medical students burnout, that got improved. So, and for them was, some of the students called it a group therapy. They got together in the evening, they went to this art school, walking distance from Jefferson, and they found it very rewarding. I think it's an important thing because it brings us back to what is that makes a good physician. I think we've been skewed too much towards the science part. There are certain traits, and Leonardo epitomizes them, that clearly are not scientific and yet I think are necessary. And you probably are familiar with how empathy drops you in medical school. Actually, that comes from Jefferson. So I think the development of the arts is an important part. Yes?
It's not really so much of a question, but it's more of a comment, and especially because we are in the faculty of medicine, and I think you mentioned to me let's say, the main two messages from your presentation is one that you should not take bullshit. This is a very, very good message. But of course, both Leonardo and Rosales were good teachers, but apparently we have made a lot of progress regarding science, mainly regarding medicine and so on. But now we continue to take a lot of bullshit, for instance, politicians. We have progressed somehow, mankind, and we've been able really to identify so many lies and so many things that are not really true and will not work. So we were able to put in question so many old writings and old theories. We are putting also, of course, constantly, and now we are seeing about all these problems, society problems, we are even putting in question religion and so on. But we are still not being able to really address politicians, not to mention bankers and lawyers and managers and many of those. So these are the ultimate bullshitters. We need to have the necessary tools to make, which is always difficult because they are hard to type and much even harder to be desiccated. So we need better instruments to desiccate their own bullshit. This is one of my comments. The other comment is that also you stress so well, especially in the comparison between Leonardo and the Zalis, is the importance of publication.
Yeah.
If you do not really, if you are not able to publish, or if you are not happy enough to have other people publishing for you, like happened with Jesus Christ. Sometimes even 200-300 years after he is dead, but they kept publishing his word, then you have no impact. So the two main good things that I think your talk
I like that. Yeah.
the importance of publication and the importance of not taking bullshit.
I second that. That's perfect. Thank you. Yeah. Yes, please, please.
I was thinking about your talk, and I noticed you told us that Leonardo he despised human beings.
He didn't have a great consideration of human beings, but he had good friends. So I'm not sure whether he was. Yes.
He said all those horrible
Yeah.
about human beings,
Yeah.
but he's always described as a charming man.
Yes, and generous, right. I think he despised, and it goes back to the bullshit issue, he despised group thinking, which is the undercurrent of evil, by the way. So part of the reason why we buy the party line, what the group says, is because it takes tremendous courage to go against the group. And if you think what happened in Europe just 70 years ago, it's because a lot of people didn't have the guts to say no. I was actually, the other day in front of the Saramagos Foundation in Lisbon. There was a beautiful quote by him. And he said something like, nobody has the truth. But there may not even exist the truth, he said. But we have the right to say no when everybody else is shouting yes. So I think that's Leonardo. I don't think it is like human beings. It is like human beings behaving like sheep, not thinking independently. That's why he writes, independent-mindedness is what saves us. In that regard, yes, he despised the group. Yeah. And that's why he was a loner. But I don't think it is like human beings. Yeah. So I think your point is well taken. Yeah.
Not human beings, just ignorant.
Eh?
Just ignorant.
Ignorant human beings.
Ignorant and abusing.
Yeah. Yeah. Right.
Okay.
All right. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Oh, thank
It was
you.
overwhelming.
Thank you.
Fantastic lecture. Thank you. Really.
Hey.
Amazing.